Welcome to Cancer and Peace. My name is Sean Stewart, and I'm hosting. I'm not hosting, I'm facilitating. Peter's hosting. I get this confused all the time. Peter is going to be hosting our podcast today. Peter Scalzo. He's been on an 18-year cancer journey, and today we're going to talk about a topic that is just kind of a fascinating, just looking at some key characters from the Bible. And today we're going to start with lessons from Job. And we thought it would just be good just to kind of talk back and forth a little bit about some of the learnings there as a guy who went through a lot of suffering and what lessons, what words God had for him, and just a little bit about the journey through that process. And so that's going to be our topic today. And I'm going to let you share a little bit of your opening thoughts, Peter,
Sure.
and then we'll get cranking on it.
First of all, I'm not even sure what the difference is between a facilitator and a host, but I am the host, right? And you're the facilitator.
The host is the big dog. The facilitator is just here to make you look
I
good.
didn't feel like a big dog, but anyway.
My job is to make you look good, Peter.
All right. So, yeah, this is a great topic. And, even for individuals who don't call Jesus or God as their higher power and don't adhere to like an Orthodox Christian faith, it's still a fascinating story to look at the literature, the biblical literature of the book of Job. And I know it's interpreted several ways, but I like sort of more of a literal interpretation of that book as I do the scriptures. And so my assumption is there was a real guy, historical figure named Job, and this is what happened to him. And this book was actually one of the first books in the canon. As far as, chronologically, historically. So it dates back. And it's interesting because it's not just an Old Testament book, but it's also mentioned in Job as an individual mentioned in the New Testament. In fact, in the book of James, where he is really applauded for having endurance, for having the quality of endurance, which means patience under suffering. And so he is a revered man in the Jewish faith and also in the Christian faith. And by way of saying that, we have this really interesting book out of the Old Testament where if you could do a play of this or a movie of this, the opening scene, you might have Job in the opening scene. He's considered a man of great respect, a very righteous man, a guy who followed the law and loved God, Jehovah, and was really revered for what he owned. He owned a lot of assets in those days. It would have been it would have been animals and structures and maybe vineyard and all that kind of stuff. And he had 10 children, so he was this man of great wealth and depth, and he had a wonderful reputation, not only with men but also with humans, but also with God, because he's referred to by God as a righteous man. So maybe the opening scene would be Job and who he is and what he is, this man of great respect and renown, and then all of a sudden you shift to a scene in the heavenlies.
Yeah, I want to even accentuate that, touch what you started out with, because there's a lot of commentators that believe that Job was probably the richest person on earth at the time, which is pretty crazy to think about.
Yeah.
And just when you put that with the fact that you and I have been around a lot of people with wealth, but how often do you think of people of wealth as the most righteous people around you too, which is the way God kind of defined him? And so I find that fascinating, because for somebody to, I think of different tests that you get in life, and there's the test of poverty, but a big test is the test of wealth. How do you handle wealth? And apparently Job did that test really well, because that hadn't tripped him up at this point in his life. And then now we enter this scene that you're getting ready to go to.
Wow. You are the facilitator. Yeah, because that's not something that I was thinking about. But that's a wonderful point about wealth and about Job. And so then the next scene is, again, it's in the heavenlies, and I'm not sure what that would look like, but there's this huge throne, and God the Father, God the Creator on that throne, and all of a sudden he looks out amongst these angelic or whoever kinds of beings that appear before his throne, almost like there's almost this insinuation that there's like this coming and going kind of thing, because he looks out and he sees, Satan, he sees the enemy, and he addresses Satan and says, have you considered my servant Job? Whether I think he states something like there's no one as righteous as him, or something like that, right, Sean?
Yeah.
And so that's, give me your comment on the fact that this is a challenge from God to the enemy.
Yes, so I've done some thinking about this too. It's what you're sharing, and I'm going to put a couple of comparisons out there too, because something that's fascinating to me is that we know that God doesn't wish to harm us, and I think even last time I reflected on Abraham being asked to go to sacrifice his son Isaac, and one of the things that stuck out the most to me about that was that God didn't ask Abraham to do that so that the test wasn't so that God would find out. God already knew. He had him go through that test so that he would actually learn about himself. And that he would grow. And so what I think I see in this picture is God saying, hey, I want to see Job grow and learn, and to go through the next part of his journey in life. And he knew that trials and suffering was the only way that was going to happen. And so in that moment, you see this dialogue going on. And if you think about it, some people think that this isn't a real exchange. But one of the things I think that's interesting about this is that go to the New Testament and look at the life of Peter. And you hear Jesus talking to Peter, and Jesus says to Peter, Satan has asked to sift you. Mm-hmm. So Satan does petition to bring hardship, to actually, I think his goals were to separate us from the kingdom. And so there is this thing that's going on, and God already knows. He already knew how Peter was going to respond. And Peter was sifted, but it was for his benefit, because later on he becomes the cornerstone of building the church off of. Obviously Christ is that all the church is built off of Christ, but Peter was the leader.
And one of my favorite, I was going to say, is Paul. When Paul has a heavenly near-death experience, as what we would call it, but he was transported to heaven, and he came down, and God said, in order for you not to become proud, I'm sending a messenger of Satan to you to afflict you. And Paul asked for it to be a thorn in the flesh. And Paul asked for it to be removed 3 times, and God said no each time. For my grace, my strength is made complete in your weakness. So same kind of thing, I think what you're saying.
The important piece for us, I think, in this moment, as we think about this, and I think the reason why we'd be talking about this in the cancer concept, or in a cancer and peace concept or discussion, is there's purpose.
Yes.
All suffering has purpose. Sorry. And so we see that discussion between God and Satan, and God actually knows Job's heart, but he also knows that Job has deep purpose that he actually wants to use in a big way in his life and reveal.
Yeah, and of course, Sean, this is a huge topic of the role of pain and suffering in our lives, and within the Christian community and outside the Christian community. And I think you've heard me say, but early on, when I was struggling with my dark nights of the soul, my wall, my earthquake event of that one surgery, I got down to, because I had to sift it through a theological framework, because I need that. I need to have a something about God that I can sink my teeth into. And so what I came down with and it was based on Job and Paul and Peter and all that, was that my cancer diagnosis, my cancer event, had filtered through God's hands first, that he had allowed it to happen. He didn't cause the harm in the sense of cancer didn't originate from him, but he allowed that to happen to me because of what he wanted to have happen in me.
There's a great, I mean, we're talking a bit
Yeah.
of theology, but I think this is important because when we think about purpose, hope, moving towards peace,
Yeah.
understanding a little bit, I think is, to me, for my own sufferings, has been important. And
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to, I know we're jumping around a little bit here.
That's
but
okay. I think this is going to be a 2-part.
Probably so, yeah.
Yeah, because this is such a huge book
Yeah.
for what, at least for me, it's huge, very meaningful.
So you see this dialogue between Satan and God in Job, but let's go back to Genesis and you look at the story of Joseph. And one of the most interesting passages in there, I think it's Genesis 50, and you see this interaction with Joseph and his brothers. His brothers had done great harm to him. They had threatened to kill him, but then they sold him into slavery, and then he ended up in jail. And it was just a really horrendous journey to him actually ascending to the second most highest position in Egypt to save his own family when famine came. And so his brothers come after their dad's death and is kind of going, hey, we think he might try to do revenge on us because now that dad's dead, he's just going to let us have it for all that we did. And Joseph's response is what you meant for evil,
Right.
God meant for good. And so there's this such a massive thing to understand is that, yes, we know that all sickness and all suffering comes from evil. In other words, there wasn't harm and suffering prior to evil, but in that very same act, God means these things for good. And so we see this starting to play out in Job's stories that, yes, Satan comes because he's looking to do evil, but God actually is going to allow through free will and through allowing, things that happened in the garden from original sin to current sin. God's going to allow those very same things to be used for his greater good, which is a greater purpose. And as you understand that, then the story becomes a lot more meaning. And I think for a cancer journey, this is super important.
It's super important. I mean, it's one of the major themes of my life. I mean, I like in sort of a metaphorical sense, I like to refer to a tapestry where, a tapestry, usually it's just a beautiful visual, but if you take the tapestry and turn it upside down, whatever the tapestry was made of, threads or whatever, it looks like chaos underneath.
Yeah.
And that's how I view, what God, how can God work within the framework of free will and enemy and then brokenness and sin? Yet he does. And, that same theme, Romans, where it talks about, and God causes, it says, all things to work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So,
and the beautiful thing about the story in Genesis 50 of Joseph and his brothers is you see how he actually does it. You see the very sinful acts. You see the acts of the brothers and their anger, bitterness, resentment, that they act this out and they tell this great lie. You see how all that plays out. Mm-hmm. And all along, God's using that to save this family from a famine that he knows is coming. Mm-hmm. And you see that at the end, God gives Joseph special revelation to be able to do that.
Right.
To be able to go through that. And I think about that, and you and I just had a conversation with a member of our team here who's in a wheelchair, mm-hmm. and he's been in a wheelchair his entire life. He has cerebral palsy, mm-hmm. and he has a lot of physical limitations. Mm-hmm. And in those physical limitations, he's feeling very limited in what he can do. His purposes are limited. And it was a great conversation because I was thinking about, as we were sitting down, that understanding his purpose helps him to know that you and I were talking about Johnny Erickson taught as an example, somebody in a wheelchair. And while you and I have the ability to walk and run and do things physically, we don't have the same limitations as Johnny. She has a platform that dwarfs anything we could think about.
Right.
And it's through her limitations
Mm-hmm.
that has developed, and it's much bigger than that. It's more complex. It's more beautiful than that. But the point that we were talking about, even with this person, was that sometimes if we only look at our limitations, there's a lot of times a great paradox, and especially in the journey, there's a great paradox, is that the very limitations that we have are the gifts that we have also of influence and open areas that wouldn't be available to us. And I don't want to minimize the suffering.
Right.
That's not the point. But you have to actually look at the bigger picture and understand. I think I have to look at my own self and say, hey, my sufferings a lot of time are an open door for where God wants me to go. And if I'll lean into that suffering, and so it doesn't matter whether that's CP or whether that's the sufferings that Job was leaning into or cancer. Those a lot of times are the open door for what God wants to do in a big way.
Yeah, and I think I don't know why I want to make this distinction right now, but Job's called an innocent sufferer, meaning he didn't do anything like this was not a consequence of some behavior that was destructive or anything like that. He had no choice he didn't bring this upon himself at all. In this was brought upon him. And I think, even though someone may smoke and think, oh, I got lung cancer because I smoked, there's several incidents of people who get lung cancer who have never smoked, or people who smoke all their lives and don't get lung cancer. So they don't know the cause of cancer. They know there are carcinogenic substances out there, but they don't know the ultimate cause. Is it a mixture of DNA, stress, the air we breathe, all that? Right. But the bottom line is that a cancer sufferer, they're not struggling with cancer because of like a consequence of their actions or whatever. You know what I mean? I mean, there might be a link to it.
Can I say it differently and see
say it differently.
Cancer is not a punishment for some sin that you may have done in the past.
Thank you.
And so there can be consequences. Like all of us do actions, and sometimes, if I eat too much, I become overweight, and those may have negative aspects. And so there could be people who have cancer because of actions. But I think in general, the best way I like to think about it is your cancer is not a punishment for some actions. And some people, my mom died of lung cancer. To my knowledge, she's never smoked her entire life. Oh, okay. And so, but that doesn't mean that she didn't sin. Well, of course she did. She's just like the rest of the human race. She has sin in her life, but that cancer was not a punishment for something that she'd done wrong. And I think that's a great message for all of us to hear, is that you're not being punished. Right. But I think I would say the opposite, though, is that all suffering is a call to draw us into know ourselves and to develop a deeper, more intimate relationship with God. Right.
And I think that we're going to get into how Job suffered, but if you sort of in the middle of his pathway of suffering, if you could sit down with him and say, hey, how's your intimacy with God going? He wouldn't say, oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, in my cancer journey, I did not even fully understand that I was developing intimacy, which I also equate with dependence upon.
Trust, yeah.
Trust. Wouldn't it, if you said to me, oh, Peter, you're developing such a great intimacy, I would have said, forget you, because I don't like going to cancer centers and doing what I'm going through,
You might want to punch me in the face.
Yeah, except you're bigger and stronger than me, so that wouldn't be wise.
Well, but your feelings, I think this is great, because you're describing when you're going through suffering.
Right.
The very thing that's happening inside of you doesn't necessarily feel like what you expect it to feel like. Because intimacy feels like warm, cuddly, being hugged, and something. If you put it in physical terms, there's definitely warmth and closeness. And sometimes in this journey of suffering, you feel the furthest away.
I mean, for me, it's in ICU. I'm going to die. The incision hurts. Everything hurts in my body.
Did God abandon you? Kind of questions come to your mind. Those are things that are.
And then I love what you said about opening a door, invitation. you used Revelation 3:20 and said, Jesus is standing at the door knocking. Will I open up a door? And my door that I opened was, where are you? Remember?
Yes.
I thought
Yes.
that was key for me to hear. Sean says things to me that during these sessions that I have never thought about, but causes me to think and really rejoice at times. But I think this is a very meaningful, because I mean, if let's say somebody is in the midst of their cancer journey and I sit down with them and I say to them, isn't it great how you're growing in intimacy? They want to punch me. So,
Yes.
So one of the issues is, how can I minister to someone within the cancer struggle? And it's really just to have a non-anxious presence. That's all, a silent hand, because we're going to find out from Job's friends how not to do it. Because they really demonstrate how not to minister to somebody who's going through.
They started out great.
Yeah, 7 days of silence.
7 days of silence.
That's the best thing they did.
It's a surprise. It's kind of shocking because few of us could do 7 days of silence. When you think about it, and so they came and had presence.
Yeah.
But day 8 through whatever became
not good.
Not good. And so that's an interesting.
So we'll get into that, because I think this is going to be a 2-part.
Yeah.
But there's such richness in this book as it relates to the cancer journey that this needs to be a 2-part.
Yeah, I think thinking about where we're at today, and just understanding just the starting point probably is the good things. Like suffering is something that it had. You said it a second ago. I think this is such an important point. It had to cross God's desk, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that it has crossed God's desk, and we know that God only has good purposes for your life, means that whatever suffering is there has a deep, meaningful purpose. And I think this is important because we talked about in the last episodes how purpose goes to hope, goes to peace. Like there's a progression that you move through. And without hope, there is no peace. And without purpose, there's no hope. Mm-hmm. And so, because if we live purposeless lives, if they have no meaning, then that's a hopeless existence. But the moment there's purpose to what's going on, then there's hope for tomorrow. And when there's hope for tomorrow,
that's right,
there comes a deep peace. And that's kind of the journey we're trying to walk down through. And so as we explore Job's journey a little bit, I think we're going to see some of those pieces click into place a little bit.
Yes, because just to pick up on the story very briefly right now, when God said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And he gave Satan permission to do certain things to Job. There was a limit eventually placed on it. You cannot take his life. But he gave Job permission. I mean, God gave Satan permission to do a lot of other stuff. And the narrative of the story is that a great storm came in and all his children passed in a storm, right? And he lost his wealth. How'd that happen again? Is just whatever.
Yeah, I think there was fire, hurricane, right. It was storm, and
right. And it's interesting because God allowed the enemy to inflict that stuff by those means.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to this book.
There is, and
not everything I understand, but
even before we even get too far to that depth, is something that sticks out to me early on, and it kind of fits into something I mentioned earlier, but it's this idea of why suffering. And one of the things that you might think, as we were talking about it from the opposite, hey, is my suffering a punishment? Mm-hmm. And I think the answer is no, that your suffering is not a punishment. But the opposite is potential, that, when you grow to a certain place in your journey, you see that God allows the righteous to take on more suffering. And the journey towards God is a journey of death to our carnal self, to ourself. And so I think what we see is God allows even more suffering for the righteous, and not for purposes of harming them, but for purposes of even drawing them even closer and nearer still. And so
deep.
that can be really encouraging. It can be scary too, because I find this to be a scary concept because I want to grow deeper in my relationship with God and in that peace and closeness. But that likely means that I have to embrace more suffering. And this is a biblical concept in Christianity. It's like, take up your cross, take up your suffering and follow me. And the closer I get, the more I recognize that it is a journey of suffering also. And outside of Western Christianity, this is understood, I think, a lot better than in our world, because we have this idea of take up your pleasure and I'm still going to follow, and so we find ways to find deep pleasure and meaning in the things that we have. And the story of Job is being stripped of everything.
And this is the James, I'm going to speak in church, and it's the James 1:2-4 message. It's the brothers and sisters, so Christians, when trials come your way, not if, it's when, consider it all joy.
Yeah.
Right? So there's that choice there that and the bottom line is, because if we lean into Jesus and the pain and the intimacy with him, then endurance is something we travel in, but the end of the verse is that you will be complete, lacking nothing.
Yeah.
So there's that emotional and spiritual maturity or deep intimacy with Jesus that is a result. So we're supposed to, that's the purpose. That's purpose right there. So we're supposed to consider it joy. That, like you said, it's so true. Purpose bringing about hope, which brings about peace. I mean, if I didn't think God had a great purpose in my cancer journey, I'm just about, what's today, July 26 or something?
Something like that, yeah.
So my first major surgery, Sloan Kettering, where I say I started my cancer journey, even though it started before that, is July 27th, 2005. So I'm almost at my 18-year mark. If I couldn't find purpose in my journey, I don't know what I would have done.
Nothing seems worse than meaningless suffering, right?
I don't know what I would have done, yeah.
Yeah, this is a fascinating, because this story is all about going from, having the American dream almost in that sense. It's like you have all the wealth, everything's set, to deep poverty and deep suffering. And so I do think we should probably carry the next podcast into,
because there's so much more in it that will be of help to me as a cancer patient, to our audience as they journey through cancer. It's huge.
This book is written for sufferers, and to really help people on that journey and to understand, how to approach that. And I love just seeing how the book plays out, and we see all the common tropes, for lack of a better thing, show up in this book. And so we're going to explore some of that a little bit. And we've talked a little bit about how do you minister out to somebody who's going through a cancer journey, and we see...
because this book is huge on just sort of giving concepts to people who are caregivers or people who want to visit cancer patients. It's a very helpful book.
It's there, and then for fellow sufferers.
That's right.
And what questions are okay and what questions are where problems exist. Yeah. So I think we'll explore a little bit of that next time
let's do it.
on this journey.
But I'm excited.
Today, I think where we wanted to get to, where we're going to land at, I think, is that we see that all suffering crosses God's desk.
Yep.
And because of that, we can recognize that it has deep purpose, because God does not...
I've said it before, and I'm just going to say it again. If we adhere to the concept that God is omnipotent and omniscient, which means all-powerful and all-love and all-knowing and omnipresent, all of these traits about God that we talk about, if we believe that, I've heard Christians say to me, "Oh man, Satan won there." No such thing with an all-powerful God. And so, like in my case, Satan didn't do an end run around, a trick play, and God was like on defense, and he's like, wow, that was a good play. That caught me off guard. No such thing. God allowed this trial in my life, and I hope that's an encouragement for folks in searching for purpose. It is for me.
Yeah, and I'll add just something I've paid attention quite a bit to Keller's recent end of life journey, and now that he's passed, I listened back to some of his last podcasts and interviews, and one of the things that sticks out the most is with this journey, he's made it clear that he could not have learned and grown in certain areas of his life, his prayer life, his intimacy with God, without a pancreatic cancer journey that ultimately ended up taking his life. And he doesn't lament that. He sees that as an important part of his journey. And I think that's a big part of what we're talking about now, is that God obviously allowed that journey to cross his desk, and he saw that it was going to take Tim somewhere that he couldn't go on his own.
Right.
He couldn't read it. He couldn't study it. He couldn't do it in any other way but to go through this door of suffering. And I think that's going to be the case for every cancer patient out there. And once you embrace that, not in the sense of celebration embrace, but to embrace that God's bringing you someplace that you can't go without this suffering, it opens the door to bringing that purpose, which then brings hope, which then brings peace. Yeah. And I think this is such an important part of the journey.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I say about being grateful. I'm not grateful for cancer at all, but I'm grateful for how Jesus partnered with me through this journey.
And I see that same story in you, is that without this journey, God's taking you places in your journey that you could not have gone without having to go through the cancer door, which kind of stinks.
Yeah.
I'm saying it's not at all what you ever want to hear.
I told you I wanted a hot fudge sundae ministry, right? Everyone sits around and eats hot fudge sundaes.
Yes.
Yeah. That would have been wonderful.
Huh. You can take that up with God here in a minute. Well, I think we're going to stop here today. We're going to continue the story with Job and just talk about a lot of the lessons and learning as his friends get involved. And I think it's a fun story to go through, and there's a lot of learning there. And so we want to explore this a bit. I think it's great for people who are suffering. I mean, I think it's great learning for people who are suffering to explore this in a lot of detail. And so we're going to continue to do that.
Yeah.
So thanks for listening today.
Thank you.
You can find more resources on cancer and peace. Peter has his book out there, and many more resources, emotionally healthy spirituality, celebrate recovery. And we look forward to hearing from you and joining you for the next episode.
Okay. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks.